Hi, so in this video I thought I would talk about sample collection, which is the first phase in how a typical anti-malware vendor will handle their back office operations. And this is really around how do they take the intelligence they get on the back end and convert that into something that's actually customer facing. And so the first phase of that is sample collection. Where do anti-malware vendors find out about threats? So for starters, with sample collection, I do want to debunk a bit of an urban legend, which I often hear from my friends and other people when I tell them that I'm in the anti-malware industry. One of the first things they'll ask me is like, well, do all the vendors have a secret room where they write malware and then put it out in the wild for people to detect? And so the answer to that is unequivocally no, at least not that I'm aware of. But for the most part, I think that there's so many real threats out there. I don't think any vendor aside from the ethical questions, would even think about creating their own samples just because of the volume that they're already dealing with. So there's a lot of bad guys out there. There's no reason for vendors to create their own samples, and as far as I know, no vendor actually does that. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there before I moved in any further. So now you may be asking, well, where do people get their collection? Where do they actually find samples? So what are some of the sample sources that we actually employ in the industry? So there are a number of different places from which you can actually get samples. So the most common, or actually not the most common, but one of the more common sources is actually from customers directly. So sometimes we'll hear from customers and they may have identified a threat on their system, or their system is acting funny, they see a file that they're not sure about. They'll often submit that file to an anti-malware vendor. And sometimes there are software applications, and in fact some vendors allow you to do that directly in their software and so on. And this is, I would say, more for the enterprise use case than for consumers, because usually consumers, your typical consumer may not be sophisticated enough to know that they've been infected with a threat, whereas in the enterprise you might have professional IT organizations or incident response teams in the enterprise that are better at doing the corresponding forensic analysis to identify that something has happened that's not quite right on that system. Now the second thing that a lot of vendors use are what are web crawlers. So web crawlers, basically, they've got a bunch of systems. You can imagine they have a bunch of systems, and these systems go out and they basically crawl the web. So they're kind of crawling the internet. Imagine this is the internet. Actually, let me make the internet kind of a cloud to kind of trace the internet right here. And they're going out. They're going to websites that maybe are known to be malicious or that they believe are malicious, and they're trying to download any interesting malware or any interesting files that come out of that collection. And at the end, they'll build up a collection of files that come from these websites and other sources. Now, as part of doing a web crawler, you might also purposefully, some of these things that are crawling the web might purposefully contain vulnerable versions of internet browsers. So the idea there is that if the vulnerable version is being used, then you can potentially get infected by having the website take advantage of an exploit or exploit a vulnerability in that browser. And that notion is called a honey monkey. So a honey monkey basically is a system that is designed purely around being able to get infected by using an older version of a web browser purposefully and trying to get infected when you go to a website. Okay? The other place where you can get feeds for these web crawlers is you can find spam emails. Oftentimes spam emails contain URLs in them. So maybe a spam email might contain a URL that points to a malicious website. So these are ways in which a web crawler can be seeded. And there are a few other ways you can seed a web crawler. You can look for known domains of bad sites. You can look for things that have been recently registered. You can look for websites associated with popular search engine terms. That's often a place where vendors, or rather malware authors, will try to seed malware. And so on and so forth. There's just a handful of ways that vendors might try to employ. Another technique for being able to collect samples is using a honeypot. So a honeypot. And a honeypot is basically a similar concept where, imagine, and it's actually similar, in fact, the notion of a honeypot is how the name honey monkey came about. What a honeypot basically does is it's basically a system, or a collection of systems on the internet that are purposefully vulnerable. So imagine they're designed to be exploited. In fact, they might run old versions of an operating system. They might have backdoors that allow a attacker to kind of get through. And any attacker kind of looking for vulnerable systems on the internet will potentially come across these honeypot systems. And when they do, what will typically happen is the attacker will go ahead and actually compromise that system and actually put some malware on that system. That's because that's what attackers like to do. And so when you find, you set out a honeypot, you just kind of wait to see what happens, and then you wait to see if that system gets compromised or attacked. Then you look at what was on that system when it got attacked. Okay, so the idea is purposefully leave the system wide open in a vulnerable state on the internet, then monitor systems after a compromise, and as a result, you can identify new threats in the process. Okay. The third way in which vendors, or the fourth way, I guess, in which vendors find threats is through third-party feeds. Okay, and by third-party, I really mean just other people who happen to have collections of malware, and that it could include, for example, there are actually people out there who collect malware. I mean, actually, believe it or not, that's a business you can get into, and you can. In fact, these people might build systems like this. They might build web crawlers and honeypots and have spam email accounts that are used for spam, and they could build honey monkeys and so on and so forth. And they'll maintain those systems, and they'll use those systems to collect malware, and then they'll offer that malware as a feed to different vendors who might be interested in providing protection against that malware. And you might be asking, like, why don't vendors just use their sources themselves? Why do they need to rely on third-party feeds? Well, the idea here is maybe one particular third-party feed might have access to a particular geographic region, or maybe they're good at collecting data on a particular class of threats, and so they kind of help a vendor round out his sample collection and make sure that that sample collection is as robust and as complete as it can possibly be, so that ultimately they're able to find and protect customers against the items in that sample collection. Okay, so that's how typical reviewers work. And so these are just different sources of malware. So let me actually just make a quick note so you remember how. So third-party feeds, again, there you have individuals who provide the feeds. Also, you might have reviewers. People who review antivirus software or anti-malware software for a living often have collections. Other vendors, sometimes vendors will trade samples with each other, and they'll work together to help identify specific threats, and so on and so forth. And these are the ways in which, samples are collected. So I'll stop this video right here, and in the next video, I will talk about sample processing. So you'll get a feel for how these different samples are processed, and ultimately how we make some basic determinations around dealing with this volume of threats that most vendors have to deal with today. Thanks a lot, and I will see you in the next video.